A lot of words spoken, but not a lot of words on the screen, because no one wants to see that, right?
If anyone would like a copy of the Epsilon annual report,
But only after.
only after, because they're going to be used for useful work in the meantime. I think that maybe it corrects itself if you just watch it.
Please go ahead, take a seat anywhere.
Excuse me.
To start, definitely do a second report here.
Just over on this side first.
When
I'll think Zoom picking up where I'm standing, or do they see me?
They see you.
They do see. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is Herb Sachs, and I'm a board member of the Beth Shalom Synagogue Preservation Foundation. And we're delighted that you could be here for this one-hour program. For those of you who came in the last 15 minutes or so and didn't have a chance to fully look at the photography exhibition, which is in the Sterling Finkel Lounge, there'll be plenty of time after the show for you to look at that at your leisure. And also, the visitor center will be open, and those of you who would like to see the 22-minute film related to how Beth Shalom Synagogue came to be built, that will be available for you to watch. And that is, as you walk out the doors here, that's directly to your right. So our program today is called Sacred Spaces, which relates to the photography exhibition, which is over in the lounge to my left. And we're delighted to have Stuart Graff, who has come to us from Phoenix, Arizona. I'm going to do a brief introduction of Stuart and then turn the program over to him. I want to, before I say any more, I want to acknowledge the president of the Preservation Foundation, David Brownlee, who is seated there, who will be helping us with questions after Stuart finishes his presentation. And I also want to recognize in the back of the room, Jill Rosen, who has done so much to put this day together, and I cannot thank you enough for everything you've done, Jill. So, forgive me for reading, but I don't want to miss any of the details. Growing up in Chicago, which is where I'm from as well, Stuart Graff was introduced to Frank Lloyd Wright's work at a young age, evolving into a lifelong passion for the work of America's greatest architect. Though a complete lack of drawing talent foreclosed a career in architecture and design, which I can certainly relate to, Stuart pursued his study of Wright's work while earning a living as a corporate attorney and global business executive, working with leading consumer products and technology companies over 30 years. In 2016, he ended his corporate career to commence his important work as the president and CEO of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, stewarding one of the world's great cultural legacies and ensuring its relevance for our time and for the future. Stuart studied engineering at Northwestern, received his JD from Loyola University in Chicago, and his MBA from Emory University. In addition to his career activities, he has an extensive history of board leadership, scholarship, and fundraising in cultural and social justice organizations. Stuart has been named one of the 30 most influential Phoenicians, which is what residents of Phoenix are called. They're not. That's the people that I envision rowing a boat somewhere in the town. For his work in the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, as well as his advocacy for the expansion of funding for the arts and public education. He is also the board chair of Arizona Citizens for the Arts and a director of Experience Scottsdale. Without any further delay, it's my pleasure to welcome Stuart to the podium. Thank you.
Okay, so let's see if I can look at this in so I can work all the moving parts. Yeah, I think we're good. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry I can't see the folks on that side of the room, so if I'm not seeing you, please don't think I'm ignoring you. First I want to thank Herb, Jill, and David. We started this conversation, about 2.5 years ago? It was shortly after the David Hart exhibition. We started talking about doing this exhibition with Andrew Peelich and his work and doing a lecture. And then a couple of things happened between then and now that you've probably heard about. And the good news is that I think it was well worth the wait. The bad news, at least for me and hopefully not for you, is that this talk is something that keeps being revised. And I suspect that this is something that I'm going to be working on, not only for the rest of my career at the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, but I suspect that once I decide to retire, or they've decided to retire me from the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, I suspect that this is going to be a book. And so you're the first folks that are hearing this, so I'd love your feedback on it. I warn you in advance that what we're going to be doing is going to start off with the Transcendentalist movement in America and a little overview of that. Then we're going to talk a little bit about Wright's biography and his background, and we are going to eventually make it to Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings and design. And the center line for all of this is nature. And those of you that are rhodophiles already are spelling nature in your heads with a big old capital N, as Wright did, because the Transcendentalists and Wright and so many others view nature as this manifestation of the divine on earth. And at the start, I want to give you some, I think, really important material from the Transcendentalists themselves. Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies, history, and criticism. Foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face. We through their eyes. But why should we not also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should we not have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us and not the history of their religion? And bosomed for a season in nature whose floods of life stream around and through us, and invite us by the powers they supply to action proportioned to nature. Why should we grope among the dry bones of the past, or put the living generation into masquerade out of its faded wardrobe? The sun shines today also. There is more wool and more flax in the fields. There are new lands, new men, and new thoughts. Let us demand our own works and laws and worship. That extended quote comes from Emerson's seminal essay, The Transcendentalist Movement. Does that sound modern, sound contemporary to anybody? Because whenever I read that, I keep thinking those words could be uttered today. They are as relevant, as modern as thinking can be in the 21st century, but they were written in 1836. When Emerson, leading the Transcendentalist movement, demanded a return for understanding the world free from the intercession of men whose claim to wisdom was merely their own interpretation, free from an intellectual framework that was derived from their insights and favoring our own insights into the world. Emerson and the other members of the Transcendentalist movement believed that each person's spiritual fulfillment arose from their own individual and unique relationships with the natural world. Moreover, unlike their peers who were focused on the emerging age of industrialism, The Transcendentalists demanded that we find in nature neither tools nor commodities, but instead that we find merely beauty. Think about that. All we should look to nature for is beauty. They also believed that there was a requirement that when nature does provide us with commodities, with tools, that humans reciprocate and that we return to the earth in the mode that all good stewards care for the things that sustain them, that we return to the earth, that which the earth has given us, that we nourish the earth as much as the earth nourishes us, both in terms of our hunger, our needs for tools, and our spirit. In beauty, they said, humankind could find companionship. And so Emerson writes, to go into solitude, a man needs to retire as much from his chamber as from society. I am not solitary whilst I read and write, though nobody is with me. But if a man would be alone, let him look at the stars. What you're seeing on screen are the stars above the driftless region of Wisconsin, where Frank Lloyd Wright grew up. This beautiful, wonderful, magnificent landscape that we still hold with Taliesin today. The Transcendentalists continue with this line of thought. In that deep force, the last fact behind which analysis cannot go, all things find their common origin. Has anybody in this room, we're in the synagogue, has anybody in this room studied or read anything about the tradition of Kabbalah, Tzimtzum, the Orion Sof, the notion in the Jewish faith, and I grew up with, at one point, they were training me to be a rabbi. I'm doing this instead. But the notion that the Orion Sof, the divine material from which God is, I can't even say God is made, it's just what God is opened up, space is opened up, and from that material, at least in some traditions, all the universe is created, so that there's the divine in all of us. The Transcendentalists believed exactly this. All things find their common origin. For the sense of being in which calm hours rise, we know not how in soul, is not diverse from things, from space, from light, from time, from man, but one with them, and proceeds obviously from the same source from whence their life and being also proceed. First, we share the life by which things exist, and afterwards we see them as appearances in nature, and forget that we have shared their cause. Too much of our lives we're spending trying to distinguish ourselves from nature. Even the language that we use, there's man, mankind, humankind, and the animals, and so somehow we're not among them. So Emerson declares that our souls, our spiritual selves, are the manifestation of nature itself, at one with the universe and an intrinsic part of creation, demanding that we recognize the unity of our beings with all that surrounds us in the tradition of so many faith systems and their Gnostic beliefs. Thoreau, Emerson's student, maybe the thing that Emerson created in nearly perfect form for the Transcendentalists, wrote this: to establish an intimate relation to nature, the human needs to detach himself from his observant position and surrender himself to the respect due to the very source of his being. In this state of mind, the individual is able to achieve a balanced and thoughtful happiness. And so, in this all-embracing transcendentalist vision, in which the divine is revealed as nature itself, the mind of a young man from Wisconsin was shaped. Now, let's see if I can keep making this work at a distance. There we go. The young man of whom I'm speaking, of course, is Frank Lloyd Wright. He was born in 1867 to a family of Welsh Unitarians who settled in a part of Wisconsin Valley in which glaciers had not flattened the landscape. And in that extraordinary bit of nature that we saw in the previous slide, the boy was impressed. He begins his autobiography, written in 1932, with a description of his 9-year-old self immersed in that landscape. A light blanket of snow, fresh fallen over sloping fields, gleaming in the morning sun. Just picture that. Clusters of pod-topped weeds woven of bronze here and there, sprinkling the sparkless expanse of white. Dark sprays of slender metallic straight lines, tipped with quivering dots. And his Uncle John directing him to walk, neither to right nor to the left, but straight forward, intent upon his goal. Wright continues. Soon the boy caught the play of the naked weave against the snow, sharp shadows laced in blue arabesque beneath. He ran first left to gather beads on stems, and then beads and tassels on more stems, then right to gather prettier ones, and again left to some darker and more brilliant, and beyond to a low spreading kind. And then eager, trembling, he ran to and fro behind Uncle John, his arms grown full of weeds. A long way up the slope, arrived at a point on which Uncle John had fixed. He turned to look back, a smile of satisfaction lit the strong Welsh face of Uncle John. His tracks in the snow were as straight as any string could be straight. And the boy came up, arms full, face flushed, glowing. He looked up at his uncle, holding these weeds. Look at what he had found. But that smile turns into a stern look from Uncle John. The lesson was to come. Back there was the long, straight, mindful, heedless line of Uncle John's own feet that they had purposely made. And Uncle John pointed to that line with pride. And yet there was the wavering, searching, heedful line, embroidered with a straight one, like some free and aging vine, as it ran back and forth across that straight line. Uncle John pointed to that too with gentle reproof. His meaning was plain. Neither to right nor to the left, but straight is the way. The boy looked at his treasure, this pile of weeds, and then considered Uncle John's pride. And in his own words, he comprehended more than Uncle John meant that he should. Because the boy, Frank Lloyd Wright, was troubled. Uncle John had left out the thing that made all the difference. Now, as we look back on this today, we can have no doubt that the 65-year-old author of his autobiography is gifting to his 9-year-old self a prescience that probably wasn't there. We all know Frank Lloyd Wright had a somewhat elevated opinion of himself. Maybe worthily so, but still. But I think there's little doubt that Wright is telling of this meandering search in the very opening of his autobiography as a way of explaining the whole meaning of his life's work. A search for beauty, a willingness to deviate from the straight and true path to find that beauty and to learn from it and to understand it and to make it his own. A manifestation of the divine offering grace through the natural world. On screen, you see the oldest buildings that we have at Taliesin, Wisconsin. You see Unity Chapel. On the left is the interior Unity Chapel. This, we believe, is the first building that Frank Lloyd Wright's pencil as a draftsman touches. And we think most notably it's the ceiling detail that you can see on that picture on the left. Unitarian was the family faith, and Wright's family believed in it with astonishing certitude. Truth against the world was the family credo of the Lloyd Joneses, his mother's hearty stock. They came to America as farmers and ministers from Wales, where a hard-scrabble life formed the basis of their faith in Cardiganshire. Wright explains the Unitarianism of the Lloyd Joneses, a far richer thing, was an attempt to amplify, in the confusion of creeds of their day, the idea of life as a gift from divine source, one God omnipotent, and all things at one with him. Unity was their watchword, the sign and symbol that thrilled them. The unity of all things. The mother, his mother, sought it continuously. Good and evil existed for her people still, however, and for her. The old names still confused their faith and defeated them when they came to apply it. But the salt and savor of faith they had, the essential thing, and there was warmth in them for truth, cut where truth might, and cut it did, truth against the world. But Wright, while being steeped in this faith, does not necessarily follow it, because as he looks at the beauty of all things, he finds himself drawn to the work of the Transcendentalists and finds in nature that very notion of God. On screen, you see the farm of Tellius, and again, this is the same driftless landscape. This is the land of his aunts and uncles, the world in which they inhabited. And so Wright comes to both faith and experience. Comes through both faith and experience to the central belief that, and I quote here, nature is the only body of God that we shall ever see. This is unsurprising, given the convictions of faith in the unity of all things. The education that nature provides young Wright running over these fields, through these forests and on these hills, swimming in the Wisconsin River as it makes this enormous bend right there in the land of his fathers, the Valley of the Lloyd Joneses. We might even describe Wright's entire body of work, the thing we call organic architecture, as steeped in design that follows from the forms and processes that nature itself uses to shape our world. And so Wright continues his autobiography. In these adventures, running through these fields, swimming in that river, in these adventures alone, abroad in the wooded hills to fetch the cows, he, barefoot, bareheaded urchin, was insatiable, curious, and venturesome. So he learned to know the woods from the trees above to the shrubs below and the grass beneath, and the millions of curious lives hidden in the surface of the ground among roots, stems, and mold. This 11-year-old was learning to experience what he had heard, touched, and seen. And his mind, his genius, in my view, was to begin to synthesize that experience into a way of being in the world and a way of using what the world offered to produce his creative output. From sunrise to sunset, he said, there can be nothing so surpassingly beautiful in any cultivated garden as in these wild Wisconsin pastures. A beauty from nature, but a beauty from seeing how nature created those landscapes. Nature is organic in man's character making, as in other forms. His instinct, Wright's instinct, was not to criticize her work unless he could know her method and discern her ends. And for this, Wright thanks the farm, the very farm that you see there. And Wright had a bit of disdain for, just like Emerson did, for all these efforts to intellectualize this experience of beauty. He says, man's puny mind so affronts nature continually, he never knows what happens to him because of his philosophy, his wisdom, usually something on life and seldom of life. He's urgently calling for us to be a part of the world. And so young Wright begins the work that will consume the fullness of his nearly 92 years, a quest to understand sources of beauty that are given by God, that take on the form of nature, that derive from the same processes that nature follows to create structure, beauty, and function. Early in his career, he studies with Louis Sullivan. He works with Sullivan in Chicago. And Sullivan's work attempts to embrace nature, but often through simulation, covering, or at least embellishing, his structures with knit vines and branches, leaves and shoots. Sullivan was convicted in the belief that a building's identity resided in ornament. Wright's Liebermeister, that's what he referred to Sullivan as, his dear master, taught his young apprentice that form follows function. That one built a skyscraper, for example, with steel posts and beams, and uses or reveals that structure in the form of the work, so that you see the structure, it becomes apparent. Strong piers, columns, convey the strength and purpose of the steel frame. But one conceals these, softens these behind the presence of natural forms in brickwork or terracotta overlay or stone. For Wright, this will simply not do. And within a few years, Wright eclipses his master's teaching, announcing instead that form and function are one, joined in spiritual union. In Wright's vision, true ornament is not a matter of prettifying externals. It is organic with the structures it adorns, whether a person, a building, or a park. And so at Taliesin, and what you're seeing is a contemporary photograph of Taliesin, not the one that was originally built in 1911 and that burned in 1914. But what we see is Wright's use of nature. Stone that looks exactly the way that limestone appears in the buttes over the Wisconsin River. This rough, regular material, supporting, offering its strength to support the land itself. And here in Wright's work, supporting, constructing his buildings. There are points at Taliesin where the building sits on the stone bed itself. And I tell you, you cannot see where nature ended and Wright's work began. That is how inextricably he is linked, his way of expressing nature in his own work. They're indivisible. We see this again at Taliesin West. This is where my office is. Not a bad place to go to work every day. Have any of you been out to Taliesin West or been out to, oh good, a lot of you have. So you know what the desert floor looks like. It's this scattering of rubble stone and brush, occasional cactus. And Taliesin West is made to look like the desert floor, folded vertically. If you saw that movie Inception about 10 years ago, remember they fold up Paris? Wright has done the same thing about 90 years earlier. With Taliesin West, about 80 years earlier. Using the material from the landscape and its forms, its geometries, to create a building so that we are one, indivisible with the landscape. And material, the integrity of material becomes this manifestation of nature. Materials revealing their intrinsic characteristic. Often when you hear us talk about Frank Lloyd Wright, when you read what people have to say about Frank Lloyd Wright, they talk about Wright's love of natural materials. And so our minds go to wood, to stone. And yet Wright uses materials not found in nature. Look at the building we're in. He uses concrete, steel, glass, and other man-made materials. It's this great misunderstanding when Wright talks about the nature of materials that we're talking about wood and stone. But in fact, what we're talking about is the nature of the material, just as we might talk about the nature of a person or the nature of anything. It's intrinsic character. And it's the nature of material that creates the spiritual sense in Wright's work. Because the nature of materials, when used properly, reveals their true inherent character, their quality. from which that spiritual sense arises. Integrity of materials is about the discovery or the exposition of inherent truth. This sense of revelation has the spiritual quality of nature that the Transcendentalists idealized. Nature having created beauty of form, of color, of strength, and inherent function, stripped of falsity, and stripped too of unnecessary embellishment. On screen, we have Wright's first independently commissioned work, Winslow House in River Forest, Illinois. We see the ideas for Wright, this transcendental thinking starting to manifest itself in the work, first in this building. He writes of this house, "The first feeling therefore had been for a new simplicity. A new sense of simplicity as organic had barely begun to take shape in my mind when the Winslow House was planned, but now it began in practice. Organic simplicity might be seen as producing insignificant character in the harmonious order we call nature. All around was beauty in growing things, none were insignificant. And I loved the prairie by instinct as a great simplicity, the trees, the flowers, the sky itself thrilling by contrast." So he's merely trying to set this building through its simple design within the larger context of nature and not to take away from nature at all. We also see Wright's quest for simplicity and for spiritual understanding in his understanding of the Japanese print and Japanese culture. He reduced the complexity of design inspired by nature from the rich and lush vines of Sullivan in earlier forms, achieving a greater visual and spiritual beauty through a practice that he sees in the Japanese prints that he calls the elimination of the insignificant. In the Japanese print and in Wright's own work, he eliminates adornment, he eliminates anything extraneous to leave merely that which is intended to achieve the ultimate effect, the sense of connection, the sense of inspiration from the world around us. Of the Japanese print, he writes, "The real virtue of the work is nonetheless apparent and qualified to speak for itself. For properly considered, like this print, it is not the art merely of a Hiroshige, but of a people. The appeal that makes the spiritual one unlikely to be heard by Western materialism with more than amused tolerance. The proof of spiritual quality," he writes, "so near to the heart of the people who have made a harmonious unit of their land and their life, becomes daily more precious as our own pet commercial expedients sweep it forever into a past, fast becoming dim, never to be reclaimed." So he's mourning for a world that he sees disappearing in the United States, but he finds in Japan a world in which our lives, the material means of our lives, the buildings, the industry, is at one with nature and not pushing nature aside. By eliminating the insignificant and striving towards simplicity, he believes we can achieve that spiritual union. Now, we've talked about the elimination of the insignificant. We've talked about the inherent nature of materials. So how else is Wright achieving spirituality? Well, I mentioned that he's looking at not only the intrinsic nature of materials, but also nature's processes. How does nature create itself? How does it construct landscapes and visions? And I think this beautiful picture of a tree that I found a few years ago really demonstrates this. Wright looks at the form and structure of nature and how it creates that processes, the manner in which those forms and structures are created. Because he believes that a glorious tree like the one on screen or a humble weed contains lessons, forms, and wonders from which we must learn. The reality of a tree doesn't offer the symmetry that we see in a child's drawing of a tree, or in ancient or even relatively modern idealized representations of trees, where we see this beautiful bilateral symmetry so often presented. In the real world, a tree exists buffeted by nature, by weather, affected by the availability of light, water, and other resources, nourished or preyed upon by parasites or bacteria that would either kill it or make it struggle or feed it. And so the tree responds to the world around it by becoming part of that world. Its shape, its form, is a response to all that is happening around it, integrated into the whole of the world as if it was part of a single organism. Today we have language like ecosystems to describe that type of integration. That language didn't exist in Wright's time, or at least not until the end of Wright's time. But that notion of a single organism, again, goes back to what we heard him talk about, the unity of all things, what the Transcendentalists spoke of in this great harmonious whole. And so Wright looks to how the tree uses them to provide stability. It spawns a canopy of leaves for photosynthesis, and those leaves develop microstructures that evolve to balance the exchange of gases, oxygen, CO2, and moisture, all so that the tree can thrive. The tree itself is in reality the rejection of the idealized form of a tree. It completely rejects this notion of bilateral symmetry. The branches perfectly flow on either side, because that's not the world in which it lives. Instead of bilateral symmetry, it achieves balance, flow, stability in response to the world. And that balance accounts for it being something larger than itself. Wright also believes that in our minds, our spiritual selves, because we see that balance as beauty, we want to respond as nature does, without searching for idealized forms, but instead simply to be at one with the world around us. For Wright, individuality is organic spirituality. When we see him use these forms, what you're looking at is a plan and an image of Price Tower, sometimes known as the tree that escaped the crowded forest, Wright's only skyscraper in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. And he emulates the processes of nature. He emulates the tree and creating a taproot system. So this building is staked to the ground with a central structure. Everything is cantilevered off like branches, but it is not perfectly balanced. It does not have bilateral symmetry. Well, I should say it is perfectly balanced, visually and otherwise, but it is not through bilateral symmetry. It creates that balance. It acts more like a tree. It responds to the need for light to come into interior spaces, the need for air, the fact that one side of the building does not get direct light, and what do we do with that? How do we pull this together into a spiritual whole? That's what Wright is doing. That's how he's emulating nature. And by using and emulating the forms and processes of nature, Wright sees that spirit, this notion not of perfect symmetry but of balance, is what gives form life. He also taps into something that today we call biophilic design, a design that we know triggers the release of certain hormones that make us feel connected, make us feel well, make us feel loved. Some would say make us feel that spiritual quality, while suppressing those that make us feel frightened, afraid, at risk. Right now, the science catching up to what Wright seemed to understand and what the Transcendentalists seem to understand intuitively, that being a part of nature heals us, makes us spiritually and physically whole. Simplicity becomes spiritual for Wright as he rejects surface ornamentation, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, because he thinks that surface ornamentation conceals the intrinsic design for something conceals intrinsic design, and instead he wants something that reveals design. Ornamentation should reveal design and the character of material. So here we're looking at Hollyhock House. Now some would look at this and say, this does not look like simple, unornamented design, and Wright distinguishes simplicity from plainness. Simplicity is achieved not by eliminating ornamentation, but by creating ornamentation as part of an organic whole. So in this house designed for Lean Barnstable in Los Angeles, her favorite flower, not favorite power, her favorite flower is the hollyhock. And so that becomes the motif, the theme. It provides structure, it provides ornamentation, it provides strength, it provides rhythm, it provides balance in this design. And this simplicity, by using one thing, creates the organic whole, a perfect integration, spiritual union of parts to the whole. How are we doing on time? Wright also sought a spiritual quality in architecture that comes not from surface decoration, which he called a kind of skin disease with no integrity, but rather from this notion that simplicity generates a spirit, a third dimension of a building. So now you're thinking X, Y, and Z axis, right? A building always has 3 dimensions. But he says you can represent a building in 2 dimensions. You can simply have it drawn out or written out or experience it as an elevation. But you have to create depth of character, depth of spirit. And so the quality of life in man-made things is, as it is in trees and plants and animals, the materialization of spirit. How do we simply create and design structures so that spirit is materialized through these notions, through repetition, through simplicity, through harmony? On screen is Roby House in Chicago, 1908, 0708. And here we see him rejecting formal symmetry, as we've talked about, rejecting other conventional design techniques of the era in favor of balance, reach, emulation of the flat landscape. We see, even from the exterior, these deep eaves that aren't there merely to provide shade, but that when you're inside, force the eye out to the horizon and connect you to the world. You see fenestration, these ribbons of windows that are designed not just to periodically puncture a wall and provide light and air while resisting the weather, but are designed to provide this continuity between the land and the man-made structure, a sense of openness. About the time he creates this building, he says, as for the future, the work shall grow truly more simple, more expressive with fewer lines, fewer forms, more articulate with less labor, more plastic, by which we mean shapeable, more fluent, altogether more coherent, and therefore more organic. By the mid-1930s, he's creating Usonian Houses. These are images from the first of these Usonian Houses. Very, very simple structures designed for the middle class, designed to be affordable. Simple use of materials: wood, concrete, and glass. There's very little else in these Usonian houses. But look at the warmth that they generate. And that's not just because of the light. It's that connection, that sense of being, even in an 1,800 square foot house that feels like the largest mansion that you can imagine because of its connectedness with the world. This is where Wright is headed. And he creates that same sense of spirituality through this simplicity. He also uses something that I hope we'll experience here at the end of this lecture. But I'm going to try to take you on a walk. I was hoping to have a movie, but the movie isn't finished yet. So I'm going to take you on a walk up the steps of Taliesin, which you see on the left there. When you go up the steps, you see up through a breezeway, and you just see this glimpse of light in front of you. And as you rise through the steps, that glimpse of light slowly opens up, and you see a pond and a house. And as you walk through that breezeway into that house, on your right opens up a garden. And beyond that garden, as you continue to walk, you see the crown of a hill that's in the center of the courtyard in Taliesin. And that's what you're seeing on the right-hand side of the screen. And when you rise up to the top of that hill, that farm landscape that you saw a few slides ago opens up before you. Wright does this in all of his spaces. He does this here when we leave the Sisterhood Chapel and go up to the sanctuary. Look at how space is continually revealing itself. Wright calls this the continual becoming, invisible fountain from which all rhythms flow, to which they must pass, beyond time or infinity, the new reality that organic architecture serves to employ in the building, the breadth of a work of art. Wright also provides that continual becoming in other ways. Continuity translates into connection. So we see in 3 spaces on the screen, the Hillside Assembly Hall, one of Wright's older buildings, in which everybody would be gathered around a diamond-shaped space on the balcony above an assembly space below, and therefore have connection, even as the ceiling moldings draw your line upwards. Unity Temple, where the congregation isn't all sitting in pews facing forward, but rather faces each other in a sense of union, while there's this intermediation from the ground to the skylight above. The sense suggests the presence of the divine. To the Guggenheim Museum, where when you stand on those ramps, you not only look at art, but you look at people looking at art, and you form community with them, where again, like Unity Temple, our eyes are drawn upward from the ground toward the skylight, and that light represents the presence of spirit. This sense of continuity and connection is yet another way that Wright achieves a spiritual sensibility. Now this next slide, I've got to give credit to somebody that I hope is online. This is the home of one of the people that is here, referred to as Teeter's Knoll, the Archie Teeter Studio up in Idaho. And I want to bring us to a conclusion on this slide, because the best known source of connection that I think people think about with Frank Lloyd Wright is the sense of being connected with nature, that we lose the difference between interior and exterior, that they become one. There's a tradition in Japanese art called shake. If anybody speaks Japanese and I'm mispronouncing that, forgive me. But shake, borrowing the landscape and integrating it with design. Wright saw this in the buildings that he visited. He sees this in the Japanese prints where Mount Fuji or other elements of nature are present in the background and borrowed to become part of the composition. And he used this concept in designing buildings to specifically incorporate the view shed, the rise and fall of the land, the trees and streams, and the glorious light. You can see through the windows in this building that beautiful landscape of Idaho above the Snake River. You can see the trees, the mountains. We can't quite make out the river, but it's down there. Wright says in 1937, any building is a byproduct of eternal living force, a spiritual force taking forms in place and in time and place appropriate to man. In architecture, as in life, to separate spirit and matter is to destroy both. And in Wright's buildings, if you separate from the land, you destroy the spirit and you destroy the building, you destroy the design. They are as integral as could be, and it's from that that the spirit emerges. So you might recognize this building. What's critical when we look at Wright's work is to recognize that for Wright, whether in selecting materials, designing with intention for simplicity, or integrating the landscape, nothing is an exercise in the superficial. Nothing exists at the surface. By using techniques that, very much like the Transcendentalists we discussed at the beginning of this talk, they're using techniques that are ways that the grace of nature itself is revealed. We are exposing the core of the thing, the very being of the thing that we are designing, not hiding it under layers of applied ornament, of unnecessary structure, of embellishment, and most importantly, not hiding it under interpretation. In my opinion, this is what many people, myself included, find wrong with architecture today. How many times do you hear about a new building going up, and someone says, let me explain it to you. It's all intellectual, it's all like the Transcendentalist. It has to be received by someone who's smarter than we are. It doesn't reveal itself to us. The Transcendentalists rejected that, Wright rejected that. Decide for yourselves how you feel about that. So near the end of his life, in a very short pamphlet entitled The Language of an Organic Architecture, Wright stated, "The spiritual is never something descending upon the thing from above as a kind of illumination, but exists within the thing itself, as its very life. Spirit grows upward from within and outward." I selected this image of Beth Shalom because I think it might be the consummate representation of that very idea. And this image and those words are created about the same time, so I don't think that's an accident. I realize that there's an inherent contradiction in this talk. I'm acting like one of those people, those intercessions, explaining it all to you. And so I want to end this talk upstairs. I want us to take a walk, if you'll indulge me, and I will take questions upstairs, but I'd like you to take a walk. And then go sit in that sanctuary for about 5-7 minutes. I was sort of hoping the day would be a little less consistently cloudy, because I'd like you just to sort of see the way shadow and light passes through. But let's go upstairs and sit for about 5 minutes. And I'd like to